Thank you all. Thank you all for coming today. Welcome to the Wilson Center. Welcome to the Asia program. Very happy to have all of you here today. My name is Abe Denmark. I direct the Asia program here at the Wilson Center. And one of our major assets, both for the Asia program and for Wilson generally, is our fellows that come from all around the world to work with us at Wilson. And one of the great things about it is that even though they may leave after their term as fellows, we stay connected with them. It's sort of the Hotel California of think tanks. You can check out, but you can never leave. And Michishita-san is a great example of that. He served as a Japan fellow here at the Wilson Center in 2015. Is that right?
Yeah. For 1 year.
For 1 year. And then went back to Japan, continuing his work, now working as vice president for GRIPS. But of course, we stay in very close contact with him. He is still a global fellow for the Wilson Center, doing great work in Japan. And one of the nice benefits of that for us at Wilson is that occasionally we're able to convince him to come here and speak with us. And so we're very pleased to have Michishita-san here today to speak with us about the myths and realities of Japan's security policy. And this is an on-the-record event. We are being recorded. And so Michishita-san will give his remarks, then we'll have some time at the end for Q&A. And so with that, I'll turn things over to Michishita-san.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much, Mr. Denmark, for the kind introduction. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming. I'm very happy to be back at the Wilson Center, where is my home, in Washington. Today, I'm going to talk about myths and realities of Japan's security policy. The objective of today's talk is to make it possible for you to better understand the nature of Japan's security policy. Overall, Japan's security policy is quite reasonable, I think, but it is true that there is a gap between its rhetoric and reality. And that gap makes it difficult for people to understand Japan's security policy accurately. So in order to make it easy for you to better understand the reality, I will talk about 6 myths and realities of Japan's security policy today. How can I move this?
You can click on that.
It's not working. Oh, there we go. Right. U.S. cover. The cover. Okay. All right. The first item is this. Myth. Japan's self-defense force is not a military force. Reality. The Japan self-defense force is a full-fledged military force, one of the most capable in the world. If you take a look at this slide, Japan is the world's 9th largest spender on defense. After the U.S., China, Saudi Arabia, it's amazing. Saudi Arabia is in the 3rd place now. India, France, Russia, United Kingdom, Germany, and then Japan. So all the major powers are contending like this. Japan has cutting-edge military equipment, including F-35 fighters, SM-3 ballistic missile defense systems, and air-independent propulsion submarines. Then, why does the Japanese government maintain that the self-defense force is not a military force? Because Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution stipulates that Japan shall not possess land, sea, and air forces. However, the actual policy is not unrealistic. Japan thinks it's necessary to possess the minimum force necessary for self-defense. So the official interpretation is this, little strange. While the self-defense force is not a military force under Japanese law, it is regarded as a military force under international law. Isn't it tricky? To maintain this internal logic, the Japanese government continues to use idiosyncratic names for the self-defense forces, organizations, and equipment. Here is a quiz for you. When we say ordinary unit, what do you think it means? It's an army unit. What is ordinary unit? Infantry unit. When we say special unit, what kind of unit is it? Guess. Artillery unit. Oh, you are the... Okay, now I'll get to give you the next one. What about facility unit? This is not too difficult. Infantry, artillery, then... No.
Logistics.
Oh, close. Engineer unit. Thanks. Similarly, please take a look at this. A 3,000-ton Haruyuki-class surface combatant ship on the top of this slide, and the two 20,000-ton Izumo-class combatant ship at the bottom are lumped together as escort ships, or goekan in Japanese, and in English, we call both of them destroyers. Funny. However, professional observers understand the reality. The military balance published by the International Institute for Strategic Studies categorizes Izumo as an aircraft carrier equipped with helicopters, or CVH. This deceptive naming is problematic in at least two ways. First, it undermines effective civilian control in Japan. In order for Japan to maintain effective civilian control, the Japanese people must know what kind of military capabilities their countries has, and does not have. However, few Japanese citizens are aware that ordinary units are in fact infantry units, and that their country possesses carriers. Second, this use of misleading terminology undermines the transparency of Japanese defense policy. When one Chinese general, army general, noted that Japan had, or army, navy, I forgot, sorry, noted that Japan had constructed a light aircraft carrier, but called it a helicopter-equipped escort ship, he accused Japan of engaging in a covert military buildup. And unfortunately, there is some truth to that, what he said. Japanese Prime Minister Abe has proposed to clarify Japan's position by revising Article 9 and say that Japan possesses military forces for the purpose of self-defense. So we will see whether he could achieve this goal during his tenure. Now the second item. Myth. Japan is moving away from pacifism toward militarism. Reality. Japan is moving away from isolationism toward internationalism. People say that Japan is pacifist, but in fact, Japan is more isolationist than pacifist. How so? The fact is that Japan is opposed to the use of its own forces in the settlement of international disputes. In most cases, Japan has supported the use of force by the United States. Pacifists don't support any use of force. Japan supports the use of force that it considers to be legitimate. For example, Japan considered the Gulf War of 1991 legitimate and contributed $13 billion to that effort. If you are not pacifist, you can't move away from pacifism, right? So what is Japan doing? Japan is moving away from isolationism toward internationalism. However, the country remains divided on this issue. There are isolationists and internationalists still contending with each other today. Here are some common isolationist comments in Japan. 1. People in the world love Japan for its pacifist image. If we became more proactive on security matters, that image would be tarnished. Plus, there is a limit to what we can do militarily anyway. So why bother? 2. The U.S. Japan alliance has worked well. Why don't we keep relying on the U.S.? We don't want to put our servicemen and women in harm's way. Look at what happened to U.S. soldiers in Afghanistan and Iraq. 3. If Japan becomes proactive on security matters, countries in the region such as Korea and China would become frightened. Worse yet, that can result in arms race. On the other hand, here are what internationalists are saying. 1. Some people in the US, including Mr. Trump, think that Japan is a free rider, or at least cheap rider on security matters. If we fail to share the burden of maintaining international peace, that view will stick. 2. The U.S.-Japan alliance has been working well, but China is rising and becoming more assertive. The U.S. is less dominant in the Indo-Pacific region, so unless Japan does more, the U.S. might not be able to maintain the balance of power in this region alone. 3. Many countries in the region trust Japan. For example, in the State of Southeast Asia 2019, this is a report published by the ASEAN Studies Center in Singapore, wrote that Japan is widely seen as the most trusted nation, major power in the region. So isolationists and the internationalists are still contending. I would say that Japan is slowly moving away from isolationism toward internationalism as a result. There is an interesting variant of this myth, which says, while Japan is moving toward internationalism, the United States is moving toward isolationism. This is an interesting contention, and in fact, this statement itself is not wrong. But the problem is this. If this is an isolationist poll, and this is an internationalist poll, what Japan is doing is like moving from like this. The US is moving away from internationalism toward isolationism, true. But because Japan was very isolationist in the first place, and the US was very internationalist in the first place, even with two countries moving this way, the US is much more internationalist today than Japan. So don't buy into this tricky contention that some Japanese intellectuals make. Third point, myth. The Japanese people don't like nuclear weapons, and Japan does not accept nuclear weapons of any form. Reality. The Japanese people don't like nuclear weapons, and the Japanese government strives for nuclear disarmament. However, Japan is realistic and accepts US extended nuclear deterrence as an important element of its security policy. Many of the Japanese citizens visit atomic bombing memorials in Hiroshima and Nagasaki and understand the disastrous consequences of the use of nuclear weapons. I teach international security affairs at my school. In the session on nuclear issues and nuclear strategy, I always encourage or require students to read materials describing the life in Hiroshima and Nagasaki after the bombing. For example, to make the life easy for the students, I tend to recommend some comic books and movies. And I recommend these to you today. One is a comic book series entitled Barefoot Gen, Gen. Gen is the name of a boy who survived a nuclear bomb attack in Hiroshima, a cartoon story of Hiroshima by the author named Keiji Nakazawa. This is a widely read comic books in Japan. There are also Barefoot Gen movies, and there is also a film entitled Hiroshima, which was produced in 1953, and it describes the life after the bombing very realistically. If you understand how devastating the consequences of nuclear use can be, you must think seriously how to deter nuclear wars. That would lead us to the fact that Japan regards the U.S. extended nuclear deterrence as an indispensable element of its security policy. When the U.S. and the Soviet Union initiated the SALT, or Strategic Arms Limitation talks, in the 1970s, and when President Obama started to talk about the world without nuclear weapons, Japan's response was mixed. While Japan supported the spirit of SALT and the world without nuclear weapons, it had a concern that if the US went too far too soon, that might undermine the credibility of the US extended nuclear deterrence. According to one news report, Japanese officials made 3 interesting points to the US congressional members working on nuclear policy review in 2009. The Japanese officials said 3 things. 1, a capability to penetrate underground targets with low-yield nuclear devices would strengthen the credibility of extended nuclear deterrence. This was a statement, not a request. 2, the TLAM-N, or Tomahawk nuclear-tipped submarine-launched cruise missiles, is an important element for maintaining the credibility of the US extended nuclear deterrence. And 3, Japan wishes to know more about US nuclear forces and plans. More recently, when the US government issued a new nuclear posture review in 2018 last year, which called for the US acquiring more robust and diversified nuclear capabilities, the Japanese government welcomed it. Then Foreign Minister Koro Tano, who became a defense minister recently, said, I quote, Japan highly appreciates that the US government clearly articulated its commitment to providing nuclear deterrence to its allies when they face the real threat posed by North Korea's nuclear weapons and missiles, unquote. So, Japan's position is, we don't like nuclear weapons, but we are realistic and is making efforts to make sure that the US extended nuclear deterrence provided to Japan will remain credible. Now let me move to the 4th point. Myth. The US-Japan alliance is there to defend Japan. Reality. The US-Japan alliance is there to defend not only Japan, but also South Korea, and maintain peace and stability in other places in the globe. In the context of its alliance with the US, Japan plays 2 critical roles on the defense of South Korea. The first role is to provide main operating bases for US forces fighting in defense of South Korea. There are a large number of important bases, US bases, especially Misawa Air Force Base, Yokota Air Force Base, Atsugi Navy Air Base, Yokosuka Navy Base, Iwakuni Marine Air Force Base, Sasebo Navy Base, and Kadena Air Force Base in Okinawa and Futenma Air Station, Marine Air Station in Okinawa. The self-defense force provides air defense, missile defense, and ground protection for the US bases in Japan. Japan has invested massive $18 billion on missile defense, buying most of them off the shelf from the US. Please, so next time you meet President Trump, please tell him. And if you don't have plans to meet him, please write him. So these missile defense systems are certainly designed primarily to defend Japan and Japanese people. But similarly important, we don't say it, too much, but the objective is to protect US bases in Japan. The second role that Japan plays is to provide military support for US forces defending South Korea. In 1997, the US and Japan revised their arrangement called the U.S. Japan Defense Guidelines, which basically defines how the two armed forces share roles, missions, and capabilities between them. And the two countries articulated how the two countries' armed forces cooperate together in case of contingencies. Based on these new guidelines, the Japanese Diet, the Japanese Congress, enacted an act called Act to Maintain Peace and Security in Situations in the Areas Surrounding Japan. SIASJ, S-I-A-S-J. By the way, if you remember this word, SIASJ, and use this, you would sound professional. And the people like, whoa, how do you know this? So, SIASJ, S-I-A-S-J. SIASJ situations in the areas surrounding Japan. What is it? What's this? Anybody? What is situations in the areas surrounding Japan?
Korea, Taiwan.
Close. Yeah, but in 1997 context, it was Korean contingencies. We didn't say this in public, so we decided to use this code term to talk about Korean contingencies. So SIASJ Act made it possible for the self-defense forces to provide non-combat support to the US forces fighting in support of South Korea. This changed in 2015 when there was a new U.S.-Japan defense guidelines, and also when the Japanese Diet enacted a new security legislation, making it possible for Japan to start exercising the right of collective self-defense. What changed? With the passage of this new security legislation, it was made possible for the self-defense force to provide not only non-combat support, but also combat support to the US forces fighting for South Korea, including, well, now the self-defense forces can protect US vessels, Navy vessels, shoot down missiles flying from North Korea toward Guam or Hawaii, and undertake minesweeping operations in advance of US amphibious landing operations on North Korea. And as a matter of fact, minesweeping in preparation for US amphibious landing on North Korea is exactly what the Japanese forces did during the Korean War. However, one problem with this regard is North Korea's growing nuclear and missile capabilities, which are actually making it difficult for the US and Japan to remain committed to the defense of South Korea, because North Korea would definitely say, in case of war or conflict, Japan and the U.S., if you are to send forces and come to help to South Korea, we would be forced to launch nuclear missiles against Tokyo, Washington, New York. So that's why North Korea is developing nuclear weapons and missiles. They are not doing so for the sake of attacking Japan or the United States, but for the sake of dividing or decoupling South Korea, and on the one hand, and Japan and the United States on the other. Just one note. Some people think that North Korea, if you ask North Koreans, they say, well, the US is the largest threat to North Korea, right? But that's a lie. The country which poses the largest threat to North Korea is South Korea, because South Korea is the only country which has the ability and the potential willingness to absorb and unify the Korean Peninsula. So South Korea poses existential threat to North Korea, and North Korea is worried about it. Now, the fifth item, myth. Japan is acquiring strike capabilities and is becoming more aggressive. Reality. Japan has almost no meaningful strike capabilities today, but it has started to acquire some limited strike capability to maintain the military balance in the region and as a hedge against future challenges. In the past, it was quite natural that Japan did not possess strike capabilities. There are two reasons. One, the US and Japan have been sharing roles and missions. While the US has been taking care of strike operations, Japan has focused on defensive operations. Two, Japan is an island nation far away from Russia, North Korea, and China, and it is relatively easy to defend. Then why has Japan decided to acquire strike capabilities such as air-to-ground missiles and to conduct research on high-speed glide vehicles and component technologies for hypersonic cruise weapons? There are at least two reasons. One is to block a possible attempt by China to achieve fait accompli occupation of the Senkaku Islands. There are no Japanese forces deployed in the Senkakus, and in case it's occupied, we have to strike, attack the invading forces and kick them out. Two is a hedge against the possibility that maneuverable warheads and high-speed glide vehicles could make ballistic missile defense systems obsolete. We've been investing so much on BMD, ballistic missile defense, but that might not work forever. Let me give you one interesting comparison here between Japan and South Korea. While the Japanese force structure is defense-oriented, the South Korean force posture is offense-oriented. Why? Why do South Korean armed forces possesses a large number of strike assets? South Korea has deployed more than 1,000 cruise and ballistic missiles. South Korea, in conjunction with the US, developed this offense-oriented Operation Plan 5015 and is developing what they call a kill chain. The reason is that North Korea does not have the luxury of simply remaining defensive. Seoul is just too close to the DMZ, demilitarized zone, only like 50 kilometers away. North Korea has significant short-range firepower targeted against South Korea. The only feasible way to defend Seoul is to go on the offensive. That is what makes Japan and South Korea's force posture very different. Let's turn to the sixth and the last myth. The myth says that if the Japanese constitution is revised, Japan will start playing a major international security role. Reality: if the constitution is revised, Japan will probably start playing a slightly more important role in international security. By now, I know you know the reason for this contention. Isolationist sentiment remains strong in Japan. Even if the constitution is revised, that sentiment will not go. Finally, just one thing I would like to say. So, in conclusion, we found that there is a gap between rhetoric and reality in Japan's security policy, and I'm sorry about it. But let me assure you today that I will make every effort to make Japan, as a security specialist, to make Japanese security policy more transparent and accountable to not only the Japanese citizens, but also the people of the international community. Thank you very much.
Very, very interesting and very comprehensive. Thank you very much. We do have some time for questions, but I would like to use my prerogative to ask the first question, if I could. I was reading, a few weeks ago, I was reading about 1960, when Japan and the United States agreed to revise our treaty, the alliance that created the U.S. Japan alliance, which was received with a tremendous amount of opposition in Japan, to the point that there were significant protests, there was significant opposition in the Diet, and the Prime Minister Abe's grandfather, had to
Kishi
had to resign as a result of this. But it got through.
Yeah.
And that's still the basis for the alliance is that treaty. Now, we all have seen polling today in Japan about revising Article 9, and that there is still a good deal of political skepticism, opposition to the Prime Minister's ambitions to revise the Article 9. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit about some of those challenges and how you expect the Prime Minister, his government, to try to overcome these domestic objections as he tries to achieve this revision of Article 9.
Yeah. So one thing Mr. Abe has done is to make the hurdle very low. So it was basically before he made his own proposal how to revise constitution. The Liberal Democratic Party, his party, ruling party, was talking about revising both a second clause and a second clause and add something on. And that could have changed the nature of the Article 9 fairly significantly. But that was quite controversial, and basically isolationists were saying, no, if you do that, the U.S. will be asking us to do much more, and we'll be forced to get involved in foreign wars and here and there, and we get, So Mr. Abe, for some reason, probably, partly because he would like to make it possible for us to revise the constitution during his tenure, made this proposal. Let's not touch first and second clause of the constitution, which says we don't possess, land, navy, ground, navy, ground, sea, and air forces. But just simply add one, third clause saying we possess the self-defense force for self-defense. So that hurdle is now very low because we have the self-defense forces for self-defense already. So that was what he did, and he's trying to make it come true, but we'll see.
Yes, sir. Wait, since we're being videotaped, you can wait for the microphone.
My name is Michael Yehuda from GW.
I read your books. Thank you. I learned from you.
Given the depth of the emotional divide between South Korea and Japan, how do you see that impacting on Japan's role, as you explained, as contributing to the defense of South Korea?
Yeah, it's really ironic how South Korea seems to be weakening its own defense mechanism by kind of, for example, recently made a decision to not to renew GSOMIA, General Security of Military Intelligence. And so that means as long as we have GSOMIA between South Korea and Japan, then we can kind of give and take very sensitive information, including SIGINT information on North Korean, mainly North Korean activities. And they must have been benefiting a lot from it because we have a large number of P3Cs, surface vessels, everything, satellites. I don't know how much we give them, but still, I mean, it must have been quite a significant amount of information that they are acquiring from us. So it's like, what are you doing? So that's partly why I believe that the South Korea's decision not to renew GSOMIA was not based on security considerations, but based on probably, domestic political considerations and to some extent diplomatic. It's a kind of good news, bad news. Bad news, South Korea failed to renew the important agreement. But good news, we can do so and get away with it. Why? Because, as I said, there are two alliances, not only the U.S.-South Korea alliance, but also the U.S. Japan alliance. They are highly institutionalized, highly, and they are there to defend South Korea. And we have passed a new law. Japan is much more committed to the defense of South Korea. Even without GSOMIA, all the system mechanism is there. So in a way, well, South Korea might be, playing the game, but it can play this game because it has become confident of the credibility of the deterrence that the defense mechanism backed by two alliances generate. So good news, bad news.
Thank you, Professor Michishita. My name is Zhong Tianhan. I'm a history PhD candidate from the George Washington University. I think in your lecture you have mentioned how the history and memory of the Hiroshima and the Nagasaki atomic bombing influenced Japan's nuclear policy. I'm interested to hear if you can talk more about how history influenced Japan's security policy, because Japan has a very long and interesting history of fighting warfare. So if you can just explore more on that. Thank you.
I think the largest consequence of this sentiment is a dilemma that the Japanese government faces. Because certainly Japanese people, including the people in the government, feel very negatively about nuclear weapons, right? But at the same time, they understand in order to secure their own countries, they are responsible. Japanese, government officials or security specialists, they are responsible for, securing Japan. So they have to realistically think about the necessity of nuclear weapons. So on the one hand, they have to say we are the only country which suffered nuclear attacks. So therefore, we have to strive for nuclear disarmament. But on the other hand, we have to say, well, but nuclear weapons are important. And when Obama come out and say, well, let's reduce the number of nuclear weapons, they say, that's a good idea, but maybe not now, right? So that's a dilemma that responsible policy, Japanese policymakers must face. And that, I think, is the most difficult, thing that this. But I mean, it's a kind of good thing that because of our experience, we can demonstrate and show to the people in the world how devastating nuclear weapons use can be, and that we can kind of, sort of educate and enlighten those people who might not know the disastrous consequences of nuclear use.
Yeah,
We follow up.
very quickly.
Apart from the nuclear issues, is there any other instances in which history influences?
Oh, I mean, this isolationist feeling, sentiment, where does it come from? History. Japanese imperial Japanese government just decided to undertake this, almost suicidal war with the United States. Most of the pre-war studies on possible war against the United States said we would lose, right? The GDP of the United States was about 10 times as large as that of Japan back in 1941. Everybody knew, or the informed intellectual knew. Still, we went to war with the US and destroyed ourselves. So people don't really trust the government or Japanese elite to be good at securing Japan. So there is this kind of doubt in their ability, which makes them think that this isolationist policy is a good thing. And when we talk about isolation, I'm not saying isolationist policy is bad. If you can, as long as you can do this, this is a great thing. You don't have to get involved in dirty, messy wars in overseas. That's what the United States was doing up to 1941. When you study American foreign policy, you always talk about isolationism and exceptionalism, right? So we are not, ashamed of ourselves being isolationists, but that's the consequence of the war memory.
Yeah, and the only comment I want to make on that, just because of a recent experience I had, 2 weeks ago, I visited Hiroshima for the first time.
Oh, okay.
And I found it to be very, very moving and very, very interesting. And so all I would add is you said that visiting Hiroshima, visiting Nagasaki, and learning about the effects of nuclear use should be a way for Japanese people to learn lessons about the dangers of nuclear use. And all I would add would be that I think it should not just be for Japanese people, but really anybody working in international security, arms control, and the like. To me, I think that those places have very important lessons to serve to anybody working on those issues about the horrors of war, about the importance of deterrence.
Mm-hmm.
So I think you're right, and I would just expand it to not
Thank you
just
very
Japanese
much.
people.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes, Dave Fitzgerald, retired Foreign Service. Thanks for your remarks. I'd like to just ask about what's the thinking in Japan now regarding North Korea and the short-range missile capability that seems to have been going forward or despite the ongoing Trump-Kim dialogue, and a willingness, it seemingly on the part of President Trump, to accept that. That seems to me to be somewhat a divergence from Japanese views about extreme pressure on, or total pressure on North Korea, and U.S. Japan solidarity on a total pressure approach to dealing with North Korea, which seems to have been undone in the last 9 months or so. Is there a concern in Japan or amongst the Japan defense community about that trend, or is that just something that's Trump is just playing off by himself?
Thank you. So before I answer your questions, let me clarify. So there are basically 3 different types of weapons that missiles that we are talking about. One is short-range missiles. Those are, ranges from like 300 kilometers and 500, which are targeted at South Korea. And then we talk about medium-range ballistic missiles, Nodon, Scud, extended range, ER. These has a range of about 1,300 kilometers, and they are targeted at Japan. And longer range ballistic missiles with ranges over 5,000 kilometers, targeted at different parts of the United States. So when North Korea launches a large number of short-range missiles, Japan is not directly threatened, right? It's South Korea, which these missiles are targeted at. But the problem is, there is a kind of concern that, by the way, and let me backtrack a bit. So Japan is focusing on pressure tactics. So, and the concern that Mr. Trump go ahead and just cut the deal. But it would be okay for Japan as long as the deal is a good deal, right? Pressure is only a means. It's not an end. End is to get a good agreement for denuclearization, right? And so we are saying, let's keep putting pressure on North Korea and wait for them to come out with a better, more comprehensive proposal for denuclearization. Because in Hanoi, they are talking only about facilities in place called Myeongbyon, which is in western part of North Korea. But there are several other places where they have quite significant nuclear development capabilities. So, but there is a concern that Mr. Trump decided to, okay, let's just take a first step, and we can talk about facilities in Myeongbyon only, or we can talk about ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles only, without addressing the issue of medium-range ballistic missiles or short-range ballistic missiles targeted at Japan and South Korea. So that's our concern.
How long can you accept that?
Well, I mean, we keep asking and telling the U.S. government officials, including Mr. Trump, to strive for a good deal. But basically, when it comes to a nuclear negotiation with North Korea, the U.S. is in the driving seat. So we can encourage them to do this and that and discourage them from doing this and that. But there is a limit, and it's going to be basically a president's call in the final analysis.
Thank you. Emmanuel Pastreich from the Asia Institute. So I enjoyed your talk, but it seemed far off from what I have seen in discussion with people in the U.S. military here in Korea over the last month since I've been back, especially on the question of climate change, which didn't seem to be very central in your argument. So many people feel now that the response to climate change, catastrophic climate change, will be such that we don't have a budget for all these military equipment. And increasingly, self-defense forces will have to focus all of its attention on mitigation and adaptation, and maybe play a greater role. In fact, it may require a military economy, but that a lot of these strategies are really about a different world, one which no longer exists. What are your opinions?
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a great point because now the negative consequences of climate change has been becoming more visible in Japan, and I don't know what's going on in Korea. And there has been a massive flood and rain in the place called Hiroshima and Okayama. And actually, my younger brother is a medical doctor, and his hospital was wiped out. Well, it's still standing there, but it was really, really undermined. And self-defense forces' role in tackling not climate change itself, but disasters not resulting from climate change is becoming more important. And also, we unfortunately, Japan is lying on the kind of volcano, kind of there are a lot of seismic activities under Japan, and so we expect with a certain likelihood that there can be a big earthquake in Tokyo or in mid-southern part of Japan. And self-defense force is definitely engaged in preparations, exercises, not only on its own, but also with local central government, local municipalities, and even private citizens involved in this. So it's an important issue. And I was talking to one of the Air Force, retired U.S. Air Force generals several days ago, and he was talking about how climate change is impacting basing of the U.S. forces. So definitely we have to address those issues.
Hi, Scott Thompson from Samsung. I was curious about your take on the get-together earlier this week in Seoul of the Japanese and South Korean business communities calling for a resolution of the diplomatic dispute between South Korea and Japan for the purposes of defense, economic, and diplomatic relations. That's in the interest of the business community of both countries, and particularly in the Japanese case, part of Prime Minister Abe's coalition, if not outright political base. Can the business communities make a difference in causing some resolution here, or at least mitigation of the crisis, for, among other reasons, improved defense posture?
Yeah, I hope so. Definitely. And I don't know. I mean, how significant a negative impact of Japanese decision to delist South Korea from this list. And I think the impact is limited. I mean, it would require a lot of paperwork. It would take longer time, so that certainly result in disruption of a supply chain. I mean, if you know how gigantic or this impact is, please let me know. But I think when I talk to government officials, their impression is, well, this is more like a procedural issue rather than, because large number of countries, including most of the EU countries, are not on the list, right? But we don't have any problem. So that's one thing. But anyway, apart from that, I think there are two things that South Korea did which really upset the Japanese government officials. One was denial of the fact that the South Korean Navy vessel used the fire control radar at our aircraft, Navy aircraft at P3, P1. That was, we have this data, it's clear. So why do you have to lie? So it was really unfortunate. And because it was really unfortunate, especially because the male-to-male, military-to-military relationship between our two armed forces had been very good, despite the different political things. So it was really unfortunate. My guess, I don't want to be irresponsible here, but my guess is the captain of the ship, South Korean ship, panicked for some reason and tried to drive away the Japanese aircraft. But maybe he didn't tell the truth to his bosses, or maybe the South Korean Navy didn't tell the truth to the Blue House. I don't know. That was one. And the other one is South Korean government's failure to come to the dialogue table, negotiating table, over this ruling over the forced labor issue. So the bilateral treaty between the two countries provides that if there is a dispute, we have to form a kind of a place for talk, and we have to participate, and we try to resolve the disputes. But South Korean government, could have come to the table and said no, right? But it didn't even come to the table. So it was like, what's going on here? So unfortunately, the South Korean government has been, I think it's for domestic political reasons, because if they come to the table, they might have looked weak in the face of, South Korean general public. But if you are a responsible administrator, you should have. So we'll see.
David Little, Herding Cats Media. The recent aircraft flyover by China and Russia over the islands.
Takeshima, and
Yeah, thank you.
Koreans call it Tokto.
Yeah, exactly. I've also caused a problem from what I understand, between the Republic of Korea and Japan. Those islands, is there any sense of resolution for that? And do you think that Russia and China are trying to use those islands as a wedge between South Korea and Japan?
Yeah, I think so. To the second part of the question, my answer is yes. Under pressure from the Western countries, democratic countries, China and Russia are on the defensive and kind of ganging up together to counteract. And that was part of the game, I think. And this Takeshima Tokto issue, it's quite unfortunate that South Korea has politicized the issue. I understand why they did so, because, and also more broadly, South Korean elites over time, starting with President Lee Sun-man Lee, decided to use anti-Japanese sentiment for political purposes. And so as a result of that, this anti-Japanese sentiment has deeply highly institutionalized in Korea. If you are, young South Korean kid in school, you are asked to draw Takeshima Islands, Tokto from their perspective. We don't do it in Japan, and talk about certainly. We started it. We colonized Korea, so that's we can, that's our responsibility. And it's coming back to us. So don't colonize other countries. That's my advice. Our ancestors did a poor job. But it's unfortunate. But I kind of understand this. Why? Because anti-Japanese sentiment in South Korea has become very useful tool for domestic politics as well as diplomacy. Because there is no. I think this anti-Japanese sentiment in South Korea has become almost a symbol of national unity for the Korean nation. South Korea is quite divisive. There is a strong regionalism. The peninsula itself, the nation is divided into two, right? And you need something to unify your nation, right? And the anti-Japanese sentiment I think is the only effective, realistic option for the time being. So, I shouldn't be saying this, but if I were Korean politician, I might decide to keep it actually alive. And we are looking to, waiting for the unification to come. In the process of uniting these two very, very different countries, you need something to unify them, right? It's unfortunate if anti-Japanese sentiment would be used, but that might be only option they have. And also there is a kind of prisoner's dilemma dynamics here. If you are a South Korean politician and say good things about Japan, you are running the risk of getting attacked. So in order to be on the safe side, you think about this, assign, values in the 4 boxes in a prisoner dilemma, this. And say, saying no to Japan is a safe way to go. So that's the dynamics. So it's very hard to get rid of. We'll see.
So I think that domestic politics in both Korea and Japan has a tendency to push each other apart. And historically, what has kept Japan and Korea together has been external forces.
That's true.
Right? A shared understanding of an external threat
Right.
and pressure from the United States. And I think what we've seen in the last few years is very different ideas from Korea and Japan about the external security environment. And the United States not putting the same kind of pressure on Japan and Korea that it had before. We actually, this is just as an aside, we had a junior scholar here a few months ago looking at the issue of historically what has brought Korea and Japan together, and they were looking at normalization, the negotiations to normalize relations between Korea and Japan, which took 15 years.
Mm-hmm.
And so I asked them, when they started the research, I asked them the question, what changed? Why, after 15 years, were these countries finally able to do it? It's not that they finally figured out the right talking points, right? Something happened.
Yeah. And
what he found is what happened, and it surprised me a little bit. What finally brought them together was in 1964, the first Chinese nuclear test, which raised the specter of communism to the two sides. That plus galvanizing President Johnson to put pressure on them to finally conclude those negotiations. So I think that's a very interesting.
Right. Thank you very much. And actually, it was also North Korean threat. North Korea started to undertake a major military buildup in 1962 under these 4 military lines. And so South Korea was under, and Saigon was collapsing. Well, not yet, but the Vietnam War was getting more messed up. And so toward the end of the 1969, after the normalization was achieved, actually South Korean officials came to Japan and asked Japan to provide arms, weapons to South Korea so that they can deal with North Korean threats. And because we couldn't export weapons, we decided to help South Korea build up a foundation for its defense industry, which was Pohan Steel Corporation, POSCO. So that was, and if you take a look at this table, where is South Korea today? South Korea is the 10th largest spender on defense in the world. So as long as conventional forces are concerned, South Korea has become very strong and is confident that this conventional balance of power has been shifting in favor of South Korea for a long time. So in my feeling, when I talk to South Korean generals and admirals, they say, well, if they North Korea attacked, they will, we'll kill them, right? They are very confident. And so I think this has also changed South Korea's perception. They can, kind of undermine their relationship with Japan, get away with it. They couldn't do so in 1969.
Question in the back.
Thank you very much for your remarks. My name is Michael Waller. I'm with the Wilson Center National Cabinet. I'd like to hear your comments about the state of Japan's cybersecurity and cyber warfare capabilities. Understand how you think about Japan's cyber capabilities in the context of Article 9. And to what degree do you see cooperation in R&D between Japan and the United States in this area? Thank you.
Yeah. Japan's cybersecurity capabilities are lagging behind the major cyber major countries. When we talk about cyber issues, we talk about is it the 7 angels? U.S., U.K., Russia, China, Israel, North Korea, 6, 7, 1, Iran, right? 7, I don't remember whether it was angels or something like that. 7 sisters, right? So Japan is really lagging behind these major cyber powers. So based on this understanding, the Japanese government decided to emphasize this, and we revised the National Defense Program Guidelines, which is the basic document for the Japan's defense policy, in December last year. And in that, cybersecurity was one of the major, items. And now, so we are putting a lot of resources and effort to this. But the thing is, it takes manpower and brain power. But you cannot really generate and train good people like this. So it takes time, and we are learning, working very closely with the U.S. Counterpart on this, and we are kind of basically in a learning mode at this point. We keep learning, and the Americans say, this is problem, that is problem, and we say, okay. And in terms of implications of Article 9, it makes it little difficult for us to undertake cyber attacks, cyber offensives, right? So because we want to be, self-defense only defense. So there is a kind of it's difficult to kind of draw a fine line. But when it comes to cyber, without kind of not really attacking, but without getting, there, you can't really do a cyber security. So I don't know how what we are doing exactly, but we are trying to find out now how far we can go legally, politically.
We'll combine our last 2 questions.
Sorry, I came a little late. Just when you were talking about that a lot of Japan's missile defense and air defense system is for the protection of U.S. forces stationed in Japan.
Identify yourself.
My name is Kunio Kikuchi, and I'm an ex-World Banker, Washington Research and Analysis. I came in just at that point, and that reminded me I flew to Japan, as I do twice a year. I sat on my last trip next to Marine Colonel, you call that, from Okinawa. And what impressed me most, he said that many of the Marines and especially the families stationed in Okinawa are concerned that they would be the primary targets if there is any attack on Japan, that they would be the first to be attacked, and that they feel like they're being hostages in Japan for the protection of Japan. So my question is, has Japan and US discussed what's the minimum size US force that Japan thinks is necessary for this continuation of the alliance that presumably protects Japan by stationing American forces in Japan? And is it necessary to have such a large footprint if the Marines feel that they're in danger to be in Okinawa to the extent that they are? Thank you.
You would like to bundle questions, or can I answer?
Hi, I'm Kenny Yamashiro from the Okinawa Prefecture office in Washington, D.C. My question is pretty much in relate to Kikuchi-san's question. We understand that the present U.S. Senate Armed Service Committee NDAA discussion is ongoing, and recently this summer, General David Berger revealed their new strategy in Indo-Pacific area, which is realignment of the forward deployment forces. It seems to me that preparing to, in order to prepare for the China threat, too much concentration is not suitable for future military deployment, and split to several places should be, seems to be the discussion to be ongoing. So my question is how Michishita sensei, do you foresee this dramatical change of the marine policy in near future, and also its impact of the U.S.-Japan security alliance, and especially forward deployment of the U.S. Marine in Okinawa? Thank you.
Are you saying that there is a major marine policy change taking place now?
Under this, we understand that it's still under discussion, while I think the discussion is still ongoing until this autumn.
So what are the one or two things that's going on or being debated?
NDAA is still discussed in the U.S. Senate, and
Yeah, but what kind of policy change is being discussed?
the relocation of the Okinawa Marine Force efforts to the Guam, Hawaii, and some senator mentioning about the Alaska, so on and so forth.
Marines would hate Alaska. It's too cold. Yes, you came when I was talking about how ballistic missile defense systems are protecting the U.S. forces in Japan, but they are certainly protecting Japanese people and Okinawa. And yes, we have to think about force structure or deployment basing, and we keep thinking about it. And in fact, the Japanese self-defense forces are kind of deploying more forces in the Ryukyu Island chain, and so in order to better cope with the Chinese naval, increase in Chinese naval and air activities. So it's going on, right? Basing new bases, relocation of, and the Japanese Air Force and Air Army has moved a chunk of those forces, their forces, away from the northern part of Japan toward the southern part of Japan, to Kyushu, to Okinawa, and other places, to Ryukyu Islands. So it's only natural that threats change, power shift taking place. China is developing even longer range cruise missiles and ballistic missiles, becoming more accurate, UAVs and others. So we should, actually, we don't have to do one big policy review at one point. We have to constantly keep reviewing what's going on and kind of make necessary adjustment. Certainly, as long as fixed sites, air stations and air bases, ports, it's not easy to just, change places. But now we are talking about how we might be able to use a commercial airfields for contingency purposes, and in order to increase redundancy and enhance resilience and all that. So this is, I think, is what's going on. Is you have to take a look at the big picture, and if there is but at the same time, you have to think about burden of the people in different places, not only Okinawa, but other places in the U.S., Japan, South Korea, everywhere. And so if there is a good compromise that we might be able to make, that would be great. So we have to get together, keep talking about it, keep watching what North Koreans and Chinese are doing, and take necessary measures, taking into account the burdens that the people in Okinawa especially are shouldering today.
This has been a fascinating conversation and a terrific presentation. I only wanted to finish with one comment. I wanted to propose an additional myth versus reality.
Okay.
Not about Japan. It's reacting to one of the items that you mentioned about the United States. When discussing your second myth versus reality, talking about Japan moving from isolationism to internationalism, you made the point that somebody else made a point of America, the United States moving from internationalism to isolationism. And I actually think that bit of conventional wisdom might actually turn out to be a myth as well. And what I'd point you to, and I'd point others to, is a recent study by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, which does an annual poll of Americans. And the Wilson Center was involved in the release of the most recent report, which found that 69% of Americans favor an active role for the United States in the world, and favored international trade, saw alliances as in American interests, in all three of those areas at a higher level than had ever been recorded in that survey's history.
Really?
And it crosses Democrats, Republicans, and independents.
It's very interesting.
So it's something to look at, but I think the United States is not, considering that we're in our 18th year in Afghanistan, we remain the most critical power in every continent in the world. I'd say that concerns about isolationism, while I think are certainly valid, the realities may be a bit smaller than the myths.
That's great. We can end with a very positive note.
Well, thank you all for coming, and please join me in thanking Michishita-san for his presentation.